The burlap sack hit the pier post wrong. Eli Cole noticed it the second the current shoved it sideways, too heavy for river trash, too still for a drowned animal, and far too quiet for something floating in a flood. He grabbed the rope before his mind caught up with his hands, dragged the whole soaking mass onto the mudbank, and drove his knife through the knot. 2 little girls tumbled out, bound at the wrists, soaking. One unconscious. The other looked straight up at him through the rain, with eyes that had already seen the worst of men, and whispered, "Please don't give us back to him." If this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, and by the time Eli Cole reached the old Redwater crossing, the river had already swallowed the lower dock planks whole. He hadn't planned to stop. He'd been riding the long way around town for 3 days now, keeping off the main road, the way a man keeps off ice he doesn't trust. Not out of cowardice, but out of the kind of earned caution that comes from surviving one too many towns that smiled at strangers right before they robbed them blind. Redwater Crossing wasn't the kind of place a drifting man lingered. It had the look of a town that had made its peace with something ugly a long time ago and decided to stop asking questions about it. But his horse copper had pulled up lame on the left foreleg an hour back, and a lame horse in a floodstorm isn't something a man argues with. So Eli had walked the animal down to the river's edge to check for swelling and to wait out the worst of the lightning. That was when he saw the sack. It came spinning out of the dark water, turning slow and wrong against the current, snagging on the broken post of the collapsed lower pier. His lantern caught it just long enough for him to register the shape, and the shape was wrong. Too compact. Too deliberate. Not something that fell in. Something that was put in. He didn't think about Victor Hale. He didn't think about anything. He just moved. The mud sucked at his boots all the way down the bank. The rope was thick and waterlogged, and his knife nearly slipped twice before it cut clean. He grabbed the sack with both hands and hauled it up onto solid ground, and it was heavy in the way. Living things are heavy, and something inside it moved, and his stomach dropped straight through the earth. He cut the binding at the top, and the burlap fell open. 2 little girls, 4 years old maybe. Twin faces, same wide brown eyes, same dark hair, plastered flat by the river water. Their wrists were tied together with rough cord that had already cut into the skin. One girl lay on her side, eyes closed, chest barely moving. The other scrambled upright the instant the sack opened, grabbed her sister's arm with both hands, and pressed herself back as far as she could go, which wasn't far at all. She looked up at Eli with an expression no 4-year-old should own, that particular brand of terror that has already calculated every exit and found none, and she whispered it so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the rain. "Please, don't give us back to him." Eli Cole had seen a lot of things in 41 years. He'd ridden through 2 wars that weren't officially wars worked. Cattle drives that ended in disaster, buried men he'd called friends in ground that didn't deserve them. He did not consider himself a man easily shaken. His hands were shaking. "Hey," he said, and his voice came out lower and softer than he intended. He stayed crouched, made himself small, kept his hands where she could see them. "Hey, nobody's giving you back to anybody. You hear me? I'm not going to hurt you." The girl stared at him. She didn't move. She didn't let go of her sister. "What's your name?" he asked. Silence. Just the rain and the river and the sound of the other little girl's breathing, which was too shallow and too slow. "My name's Eli," he said. "Just Eli. I'm nobody important, I promise you that. But your sister there, she needs to get warm and she needs to get dry, or she's going to be in real trouble. Will you let me help her?" The girl's jaw tightened. She looked down at her sister, then back up at him, and he could see her doing the math. The desperate, terrible math of a child who has learned that trusting the wrong person costs everything. "Her name is Lily," the girl said finally. Her voice was small and worn like a thing that had been used past its limits. "I'm Lucy." "Lucy." Eli repeated. All right. Lucy, I'm going to pick Lily up now very carefully. I'm going to carry her up to my horse, and then I'm going to find somewhere warm and dry. Can you walk? Lucy looked at her own feet. Her shoes were gone. Her dress was in ribbons at the hem. Yes, she said, like admitting it cost her something. Okay. He reached for Lily, slowly watching Lucy's face the whole time, and when the unconscious girl didn't react to being lifted, Lucy made a sound low in her throat. Not a cry. Something worse than a cry. Something that had already cried itself out. And she reached out and grabbed the edge of Eli's coat and didn't let go. He carried Lily up the bank with Lucy holding on to him, and he didn't say a word about the mud or the rain or the fact that his lame horse was now going to have to carry 2 children through a storm. Some situations didn't need commentary. They just needed someone to keep moving. Copper accepted the weight without complaint. Eli settled Lily against the saddle, kept one hand on her to hold her steady, and looked down at Lucy, walking beside him, with her bare feet in the mud, and her jaw set like a much older woman's. "Is there a doctor in this town?" he asked. Lucy's expression shifted. Something behind her eyes went careful. "Dr. Marsh," she said. "But he works for Mr. Hale." Eli absorbed that. "Who's Mr. Hale?" Lucy didn't answer right away. She looked out at the river, at the dark water still churning past the broken pier, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat in the way that meant she was keeping it flat on purpose. "He's the man who put us in the sack." The rain intensified. Eli pulled his coat off with one hand and draped it over both girls as best he could, and he walked Copper up the bank road toward the lights of Redwater Crossing without saying anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything to say. There was just the road and the rain and the sound of Lily's breathing, getting a little stronger with every 100 yards, which was the only good thing happening in the world at that particular moment. The town appeared out of the dark, the way frontier towns always did in a storm, reluctantly, like it would rather not be seen. A single main road. A saloon with half its windows lit. A general store with boards over the porch. A church at the far end with a cracked bell tower. And between the saloon and the store, a narrow building with a lamp burning in the side window and a painted sign above the door that read, "Physician, Dr. A. Marsh." Eli stopped in front of it and looked at Lucy. "You said this doctor works for Hale." "Yes, sir." "Then why's his light still on at this hour in this storm?" Lucy chewed her lip. "I don't know." "Is there anybody in this town who doesn't work for Hale?" Lucy thought about it with a seriousness that was painful to watch. "Mrs. Aldine," she said at last. "She's the midwife. She helped my mama when we were born. Mama said she was the only woman in town who wasn't afraid." "Where does she live?" "Past the church. Blue door." Eli turned Copper away from the physician's sign and kept walking. The blue door was on a small house set back from the road, separated from its neighbors by a vegetable garden that the rain had turned into a mud field. Light showed through the curtain cracks. Eli knocked, keeping one hand on Lily, who had started to shiver in a way that was actually encouraging. Shivering meant her body was fighting. The door opened a crack. One eye. Gray hair. A face so lined it looked like a map of somewhere difficult. "We're closed," said the woman. "I know it's late," Eli said. "I pulled these 2 children out of the river not 20 minutes ago. They were in a tied burlap sack. This one's unconscious, and this one's not far behind. I need help, and I was told you're a woman who isn't afraid." The eye behind the crack moved to Lucy, then to Lily, then back to Eli. A very long pause. "Who told you that?" "She did." He nodded toward Lucy. Another pause. Then the door opened all the way, and Mrs. Aldine, 60 years old, if she was a day wearing a housecoat and holding a lamp, like a weapon, looked at both children for exactly 3 seconds before she said, "Get them inside," and stepped back. The house was warm and close and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. Mrs. Aldine had Lily laid out on her work table before Eli had fully come through the door, and she moved fast for a woman her age, stripping the wet dress away, checking the girl's pulse at the wrist and the throat, pulling a wool blanket off the rack near the fireplace. "These marks," she said without looking up. "Her wrists." "Cord. Both of them," Eli said. "How long were they in the water?" "I don't know. Long enough. She breathed water." "Not much. She was under tarp inside the sack, still wet through, but her airway was clear when I got to her." Mrs. Aldine nodded and kept working. Lucy stood beside the table and watched her sister with her arms crossed tight over her chest, and she hadn't made a sound since they came inside, and that silence was worse than any crying. Eli crouched beside her. "She's going to be all right," he said. "You don't know that," Lucy said. "You're right," he said. "I don't, but that woman up there does, and she's already acting like she does, which is a good sign." Lucy looked at him sideways. Something in her face shifted, not trust, not quite, but the first faint possibility of it. She turned back to watch Mrs. Aldine. "They bruised," Mrs. Aldine said quietly, more to herself than to anyone. Then louder. "Sedated. Something in her system. She'll sleep it off. But these bruises." She pressed her lips together and stopped talking. "There's more," Lucy said. Everyone looked at her. Lucy had her arms still crossed, chin up, eyes steady, looking like a child who has decided the only way forward is through. "They hurt us before they put us in the sack," she said. "Not tonight, other nights. They hurt Lily more because she cries louder, and Mr. Hale said it annoyed him." The room went very still. Mrs. Aldine set down her cloth slowly. She did not look at Eli. She looked at Lucy with an expression that held so many things at once: grief, fury, guilt, recognition, that it was almost too much to witness. "Lucy," she said, "where is your mother?" Lucy's carefully maintained steadiness cracked just slightly at the edges. Just for a second. Then she had it back. "We don't know," she said. "She's been gone a long time, since before the cold got bad. They told us she went crazy and left, but—" She stopped. "But," Mrs. Aldine said gently. "But we heard her," Lucy said. "We heard her screaming the night the men came to our house. We heard her screaming downstairs, and then we heard nothing. And then men we didn't know put us in a wagon and said we were going somewhere safe." Her eyes went flat. "It wasn't safe." Eli stood up slowly. He put his hat back on his head and looked at Mrs. Aldine across the room, and something passed between them that didn't need words, the specific heavy communication of two people who have both just understood that the thing they're standing in the middle of is much larger and much darker than it appeared from the outside. "Victor Hale," Eli said. Mrs. Aldine's jaw tightened. She said nothing. "That's the name," Eli said. "That's the man this child is afraid of. That's the man running whatever's happening in this town." He paused. "How far does it go?" Mrs. Aldine was quiet for a long moment. She smoothed the blanket over Lily's still form with both hands, carefully, the way you do something when you need your hands busy, because your mind is working very hard. "Victor Hale owns the river crossing rights," she said at last. "Owns half the property deeds in the county. Owns the sheriff, or close enough, as makes no difference. And he runs cargo through his barges that nobody asks questions about, because the last two people who asked questions—" She stopped, reconsidered, looked at Lucy, finished more quietly. They stopped asking. "Claire Harper," Eli said. "That the mother's name—" Mrs. Aldine looked at him sharply. "How do you know that name?" "I don't. I'm guessing because these two children are clearly from somebody, and somebody wanted them gone, and the somebody who wanted them gone is named Hale, and that means their mother got close enough to something that Hale felt the need to disappear an entire family to keep it quiet." He looked at Lucy. "Her name is Claire." Lucy nodded once. Eli rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the door. He looked at Lily on the table, beginning now to stir slightly, color creeping back into her face. He looked at Lucy, who was watching him with those ancient, evaluating eyes. "I need to know everything you remember," he said to Lucy. "Not tonight. Your sister needs you tonight, and you need rest. But tomorrow morning early, before anyone in this town knows you're here, I need to know everything." "Why?" Lucy asked. It was a fair question. Eli considered it honestly. "Because I pulled you out of a river," he said. "And I don't generally put things back where they don't belong." Lucy studied him for a long time. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it, because she finally uncrossed her arms and walked to the table and took her sister's hand. Lily's eyes fluttered. "Lucy." Her voice was barely there, dry and cracked and small but present. Lucy leaned down close. "I'm here," she said. "It's okay. A man found us. A good man." Lucy glanced back at Eli. He stood there in the lamplight with mud on his boots and river water still dripping from the brim of his hat, looking like nothing in particular, which is sometimes exactly what a good man looks like. "I think so," Lucy said. "I'm not sure yet." "Okay," Lily whispered and closed her eyes again. Mrs. Aldine pulled Eli aside while the twins settled, lowering her voice to barely above a breath. "You understand what you've walked into," she said. It wasn't a question. "Getting clearer by the minute," he said. "Hale has men watching this street. Not always. But in a storm when things move around he gets nervous. He'll know those girls are missing by morning if he doesn't already." "Then we don't have much night left," Eli said. "No," she agreed. "We don't." He looked at the window. The rain was still hammering the glass, but the lightning had moved off to the east, which meant the worst of it was passing. By dawn, the roads would be passable. By dawn, anyone looking for two small girls and the man who found them would have clear weather to look in. "Is there a federal presence anywhere near this county?" he asked. Mrs. Aldine almost laughed. Almost. It didn't quite make it to her face as anything except a very tired, very bitter kind of grimace. "The nearest U.S. Marshal's office is 2 days' ride in good weather," she said. "Hale's had 3 attempts made to contact them in the past 4 years. 2 of those men never made it out of the county. And the third came back and sold his property and moved his family to Oregon." Eli nodded slowly. He looked back at the 2 girls, Lily sleeping now, Lucy sitting beside her with her head beginning to droop despite herself, the body finally winning the argument against the mind's insistence on staying vigilant. "Then we're doing this the long way," he said quietly. "Doing what exactly?" Mrs. Aldine asked. Eli picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands once the way a man does when he's made a decision he can't unmake. "Making sure those children don't disappear again," he said, "and making sure the man who put them in that river answers for it somewhere that isn't his own courtroom." Mrs. Aldine looked at him for a long time. She had the eyes of a woman who had lived in this town through too many years of looking away, and she knew it, and she was tired of knowing it. "You ride in here alone," she said. "No badge, no name I recognize. What makes you think you can do what nobody else in this county has managed?" Eli set his hat back on his head. "Nobody else pulled those girls out of the river tonight," he said. And that, for the moment, was the only answer either of them had. Outside, the storm rolled east. The river ran dark and fast below the town. And in a small house, with a blue door, 2 little girls breathed in the warmth, holding on to each other the way they had learned to hold on in the worst of the dark, with everything they had, and the quiet, desperate faith that morning would come. Lily woke just before 3 in the morning, and the first thing she did was scream. Not loud. The sound that came out of her was small and cracked, more like something breaking than something crying, but it was enough to bring Mrs. Aldine in from the back room at a run, and enough to jerk Lucy straight upright from the chair she'd finally fallen asleep in, both hands out, both eyes wild. "Lily! Lily, stop! It's me!" Lucy was off the chair and beside the table before she was fully awake. "It's me, I'm right here." Lily grabbed her sister's arm with both hands and held on. Her eyes swept the room, the lamp, the herb bundles, the unfamiliar ceiling, and stopped on Eli, who had stayed in the corner near the window, the way he'd stayed all night watching the street, not sleeping. "That's Eli," Lucy said quickly. "He's the one who found us. He cut us out." Lily stared at him. She was smaller than Lucy, or maybe just looked at something in the way she carried herself folded inward, like she'd gotten into the habit of taking up as little space as possible. She had a bruise along her left jaw that hadn't been visible in the dark. "You were in the river," she said to Eli. Not a question. A test. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Lily processed that. Her grip on Lucy loosened by exactly 1 degree. "Is Mama here?" The room got very quiet. Lucy looked at Eli. Eli looked at Mrs. Aldine. Mrs. Aldine looked at her own hands, and in that half-second of silence, Lily got the answer she hadn't been given out loud, and her face did something that a child's face should never have to do. "They didn't let her go," Lily said. "We don't know that," Lucy said immediately. "They didn't." Lily's voice was flat and certain in the way that only comes from having thought about something so many times it's gone past fear into something colder. "I heard what the man said. When they put us in the wagon after the night, Mama stopped screaming. I heard him tell the other one. He said the woman's handled. That's what he said. The woman's handled." Nobody spoke. Eli looked at the floor. He kept his face still, because the alternative was letting these 2 children see what was happening behind it, and they didn't need that right now. They'd been carrying enough. "Lily," Mrs. Aldine said carefully, "do you know where they took your mother? Did you hear anything else? A place, a name?" Lily shook her head, then stopped. Her eyes went somewhere else for a moment, back to a night that was clearly still running behind them, like water under ice. "The big house," she said. "By the river, the one with the lights that never go out." Mrs. Aldine went perfectly still. Eli raised his head. "You know that place," he said to her. It wasn't a question either. "Everyone in this county knows that place," Mrs. Aldine said, and her voice had gone careful, in the way that meant the words underneath the words were much larger. "Victor Hale's estate, 3 miles downriver. He calls it a trading post. What it is—" She stopped, started again. "What it is, nobody says out loud." "Say it now," Eli said. Mrs. Aldine looked at both girls, then at Eli, then made the decision. "People go in," she said quietly. "Workers. Transient men mostly. Women sometimes. They go in through the river entrance on the barges. And they don't come back out the way they went in." She paused. Claire Harper figured out what he was moving. And Claire Harper had the kind of evidence that doesn't just go away when you make the person disappear. "What kind of evidence?" Eli said. "Ledgers," Lucy said. Everyone looked at her again. Lucy reached into the torn front of her dress inside, where a child might hide something small against the skin, and pulled out a folded piece of oilskin, barely larger than a playing card, damp at the edges, but intact. She held it out toward Eli. "Mama gave it to us," she said. "The night before she disappeared. She said if anything happened, keep it against your skin, don't let anyone take it, and find someone who doesn't work for Mr. Hale." Eli took it. He unfolded the oilskin with both hands, steady, and inside was a small folded paper, water-stained but legible, covered in tight, careful handwriting. Names, dates, numbers, cargo entries with no cargo listed, a column of initials running down one side. He read it for 30 seconds and then folded it back up and put it in his breast pocket and buttoned the flap. "Your mama was brave," he said to Lucy. "Braver than most men I've known." Lucy's jaw tightened. "Is it enough to help her?" "It's a start," Eli said. "It's a real start." That was when someone knocked on the front door. 3 knocks. Hard. Official. Mrs. Aldine's hand went to her throat. Lucy grabbed Lily's wrist. Eli was already moving, not toward the door, sideways toward the lamp, which he turned down to barely aglow with one practiced motion. "Get in the back," he said quietly. "Both of you. Don't make a sound." He didn't wait to see if they obeyed. He trusted Lucy to get them moving because he'd already learned that Lucy got things moving. He crossed to the side of the door and put his back to the wall and waited. 3 more knocks. Then a voice, deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who isn't used to doors staying closed against him. "Mrs. Aldine, open up. Sheriff's business." Eli glanced at Mrs. Aldine. She stood in the middle of her own front room, looking like a woman who had practiced this moment in her head a dozen times and was now discovering that the real version was worse than all the practice. He shook his head once, slow. She understood. She walked to the door with both hands clasped in front of her and opened it 2 inches chain still on and said, "It's past 3 in the morning, deputy. Whatever business the sheriff has can wait for daylight." "Afraid it can't, ma'am." A pause. "We're looking for 2 young girls, about 4 years old. They were under protective custody, and they've gone missing in the storm. We just want to make sure they're safe." "I haven't seen any children tonight," Mrs. Aldine said, and her voice was so even, so steady, that Eli felt a deep, quiet respect for her move through him like a current. "I've been home all evening. The storm kept everyone inside." Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that's also a pressure. "Mind if I take a look inside, ma'am, just to be thorough?" "I do mind," Mrs. Aldine said. "A woman alone in her home at 3 in the morning has every right to mind a man looking inside without a proper warrant. You bring me paper from a judge and I'll open this door wide. Until then, good night, deputy." She closed the door. Her hands when she turned around were shaking badly enough that she pressed them flat against her skirts to stop it. Eli listened. Footsteps on the porch. A long moment of nothing. Then footsteps moving away. He didn't move from the wall for another full minute. When he finally exhaled, it came out slower than he intended. "He'll be back," Mrs. Aldine said. "Mrs." "Yes," Eli agreed. "With more men. Or he'll go back to Hale and tell him they haven't found them yet, which buys us a little time, but not much." He looked toward the back room. "We can't stay here." "Where do you propose to go?" Mrs. Aldine asked. "In this storm with 2 exhausted children and every man on Hale's payroll between here and the county line." Eli thought about the note in his breast pocket. The names, the dates, the initials running down one side. He thought about what a U.S. Marshal would do with a piece of paper like that, and what a corrupt county sheriff would do if he found it first. "There has to be someone," he said. "Someone in this town Hale doesn't own. Someone with a horse and the kind of quiet loyalty that doesn't need explaining." Mrs. Aldine was already shaking her head before he finished. Then she stopped shaking it. Something moved across her face, a memory surfacing reluctant. "Tom Briggs," she said, like the name tasted complicated. "He was a river deputy. 7 years ago, Hale tried to bring him into his arrangement, and Tom said no, and Hale had him fired, and his property liens called in all at once. Lost his farm. Lost most of what he had. He fixes wagons now out behind the feed store. He's a drunk and he's angry, and he hasn't trusted a stranger in years." "But he's not bought," Eli said. "No," Mrs. Aldine admitted. "He's not bought." "That's enough," Eli said. "That's more than enough." Lucy appeared in the doorway of the back room. She'd gotten Lily settled and come back, and she stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her eyes clear and sharp in a way that was going to break someone's heart someday when they finally understood what it had cost her to get that way. "The man at the door," she said. "His name is Deputy Carroll. He's the one who drove the wagon the night they took us." Eli looked at her. "You're sure?" "I know his voice," Lucy said. "I'll know it the rest of my life." Something cold settled in Eli's chest. Deputy Carroll. He filed the name away in the same place he'd filed the initials on Claire Harper's paper, where things went when they were going to matter later. "All right," he said. He pulled on his coat and checked the window to the street out of habit. "Mrs. Aldine, I need you to stay here with Lily. Can you do that?" "And what are you going to do?" she asked. "Go find Tom Briggs." "At 3 in the morning in a flood storm." "Best time," Eli said. "Nobody else is going to be out looking for me." Mrs. Aldine stared at him. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She went to the cabinet beside the fireplace and opened the bottom drawer and came back with a short-barreled pistol, which she held out handle first. "My husband's," she said. "He's been gone 12 years, but I kept it clean. Eli looked at it. He had his own gun, had worn it low on his left hip since he was 19 years old, but he understood what she was offering wasn't just the weapon. He took it from her and set it on the table between them. "Keep it," he said. "You might need it more than I do." She didn't argue. Lucy followed him to the door. He was reaching for the handle when she said quietly, "Eli." He turned. "My mother is still alive," Lucy said. "I don't know how I know, but I know." Eli looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was low, and the room was full of shadow, and she was 4 years old, standing in a dead woman's borrowed blanket telling him something true. "I believe you," he said, and he meant it. The street outside was empty and black and moving with rain, and Eli Cole pulled his hat down and walked into it. The feed store was at the far end of the main road past the church, past the point where the street lamps gave out entirely. The wagon repair shop behind it was dark, except for a single orange glow at the back, a brazier still burning, which meant someone was still awake, or had been recently. Eli skirted the main building and came around the backside and stopped at the open workshop door. A man sat on an upturned crate, a bottle between his knees, staring at nothing. Big man, heavy in the shoulders. The kind of face that had been handsome before something knocked most of the warmth out of it. He looked up at Eli without reaching for anything, which meant either he was too drunk to react, or he'd already decided nothing could surprise him anymore. "Tom Briggs," Eli said. "Who's asking?" "Nobody with a badge or a connection to Victor Hale," Eli said. "That narrow it down enough." Tom Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "Not particularly," he said, "but you can come in out of the rain." Eli came in. He stood across from Briggs and didn't reach for anything, and let the man look at him the way a man looks at something he's trying to calculate the danger of. "I've got 2 children," Eli said, 4 years old, that I pulled out of the river tonight in a tied burlap sack. I've got a piece of paper their mother hid before she disappeared. I've got Deputy Carroll actively looking for those children right now on Hale's orders. And I've got about 3 hours before daylight makes all of this significantly harder." Tom Briggs lowered the bottle from his lips without drinking from it. "Claire Harper's girls," he said. Eli went very still. "You know them." "I know their mother." Something shifted in Briggs's face, that particular shift of a man who has been feeling guilty about something for a long time and has just been handed a reason to stop feeling guilty and start doing something about it. "Claire came to me 6 weeks ago. Said she had proof of what Hale was running through those barges. Asked if I knew anyone who could get word to the federal office in Abilene." "What did you tell her?" Briggs set the bottle down on the ground beside the crate. He didn't pick it back up. "I told her to be careful," he said. "I told her the last man who went to the federal office didn't make it." He paused. "I should have told her more. I should have done more." "You can do more now," Eli said. Briggs looked at him. "What do you need?" "A horse that can make Abilene in 2 days," Eli said. "And a rider who knows the back roads well enough to stay off anything Hale's men patrol." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. The rain drove against the roof above them. The brazier popped and settled. "I know a route," Briggs said slowly. "Long way around the South Ridge line. Hale's men don't bother with it because in good weather it adds half a day. In flood season—" He stopped. "It's rough, but it's clear. Can you ride it?" "I haven't been sober enough to ride anything in 8 months," Briggs said. "Tonight you are," Eli said. "Or close enough." Briggs stood up. He was taller than he'd looked, sitting down, broader across the chest, harder in the jaw. He looked like a man remembering that he used to be someone worth reckoning with. "The girls," he said. "They're safe right now. With Mrs. Aldine. For as long as that stays true, which is not going to be long." Briggs reached behind him and picked up his coat off the wall hook. He looked at the bottle on the ground for exactly 1 second. Then he stepped over it and walked past Eli toward the door. "I'll need that paper," he said. "I'll get you a copy," Eli said. "The original stays with me." Briggs stopped, turned, studied him. "Why?" Eli looked back at him straight. "Because the original is evidence," he said. "And evidence needs to be somewhere Hale can't get to it. And right now, the safest place in this county is on a man Hale doesn't know exists yet." Briggs thought about that. Then he nodded once, short and final, the way men nod when they've decided to stop weighing a thing and just carry it. "All right," he said. "Let's go get your copy made." They walked back into the rain together, and behind them, the bottle sat alone on the workshop floor. And Tom Briggs did not look back at it once. Briggs rode out before 4 in the morning, taking the South Ridgeline route with a copy of Claire Harper's paper tucked inside his boot, and 3 days' worth of dried provisions in his saddlebag. Eli watched him go from the edge of the feed store, and then walked back through the rain without looking behind him. Because watching a man ride away doesn't change whether he makes it or not. And right now, there were other problems demanding his full attention. He was halfway back to Mrs. Aldine's when Lucy stepped out of the alley beside the milliner's shop and nearly gave him a heart attack. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I know," Lucy said. She was wearing a coat 3 sizes too big. Mrs. Aldine's clearly, and her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that were already soaking through. "Lily's awake. She remembers something." Eli looked down at her for exactly 1 second. Then he grabbed her hand and they walked fast and quiet the rest of the way to the blue door. Lily was sitting up on Mrs. Aldine's work table, wrapped in the wool blanket color back in her face, but her eyes running hot with something between urgency and terror. The moment Eli came through the door, she pointed at him like she'd been waiting. "The tunnel," she said. Eli stopped. "What tunnel?" "Under the big house. The one by the river." Lily leaned forward, gripping the blanket with both fists. "When they brought us there the first time before the wagon before tonight, we went in through the bottom. Stairs that go down under the water. There's a door in the rocks by the riverbank. You can't see it when the water's normal, but when the river's high, like tonight, it's underwater, and nobody watches it because they think nobody would go in that way." Mrs. Aldine was already shaking her head. "Child, if that entrance is underwater in a flood—" "There's a rope," Lily said. "A guide rope. I saw one of the men use it when they brought supplies in the back way. He held on to it under the water and went down and then up inside. It wasn't far." She looked at Eli with absolute certainty. "Mama is in the rooms below. I know because I heard her voice through the floor the last night we were there. She was talking. She was still talking." The room went very quiet. Eli looked at Mrs. Aldine. Mrs. Aldine looked at Lily, the way a woman looks at something that has just turned her entire understanding of a situation sideways. "How long ago was this?" Eli asked Lily. "Before the big storm started," Lily said. 2 days, maybe 3. I don't know, the days all feel the same in the dark." 2 days. That was recent enough to matter. That was recent enough that Claire Harper might still be exactly where her daughter heard her. Eli turned to Mrs. Aldine. "Do you know if Hale has men on the riverside of the estate tonight?" "He always has men on the riverside," Mrs. Aldine said. "That's where the barges dock. That's where everything moves." She crossed her arms. "Eli, you cannot go into that building alone. You cannot go into it at all. Not tonight. Not with a flood running and Hale's entire operation on high alert because 2 children have gone missing." "I know," Eli said. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Eli said slowly, "that a flood changes things. His men are going to be watching the roads and the town. They're not going to expect anyone to come in from the riverside in floodwater at 4 in the morning because no sane person would do that." Mrs. Aldine stared at him. "Are you a sane person?" "Debatable," Eli said, "but I'm the only option currently available." Lucy stepped forward. She'd been standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and he'd known from the moment she came into the room that she was going to say exactly what she said next. "We're coming with you," she said. "Lily knows the inside of that building. You don't. You'll get lost in the dark before you find the stairs." "Absolutely not," Eli said. "Then you'll be going in blind," Lucy said. "And you'll be going alone. And you won't find her in time." Eli looked at Lily. Lily looked back at him with those steady, ruined eyes and nodded once. He looked at Mrs. Aldine. "Don't look at me," Mrs. Aldine said. "She's right, and you know it." He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he pulled his coat straight and said, "You stay behind me every step. You do exactly what I say when I say it without asking why. The second I tell you to run, you run. You understand me?" "Yes," both girls said at once in exactly the same voice, which was both reassuring and the most unsettling thing he'd ever heard. They went out through Mrs. Aldine's back garden and moved along the fence line, away from the main road. The storm was still running, but the worst of the lightning was east, and the rain had settled into a steady, hard rhythm that covered sound, which was the only good thing it was doing. Eli kept the girls between him and the fence, moving low and quiet, checking each gap and crossing before he let them move through. 3 blocks from Mrs. Aldine's house, he saw the first of Hale's men. 2 of them standing under the overhang of the shuttered hardware store, not making any particular effort to look casual. They were watching the main road and the approach to the doctor's office. They hadn't seen him yet. Eli put his hand flat against the girls' backs and pressed gently, and they stopped without a sound. He counted to 15. Then he took them left down a narrow gap between buildings, skirting wide around the watchers, adding 10 minutes to the route, but keeping them invisible. Lucy didn't ask questions. Lily watched where she put her feet. He was starting to understand that these 2 children had been surviving on their own long enough to know how. The river road south of town was empty and black, and the water was so loud now it covered even the sound of their footsteps. 3 miles felt like much more in the dark, with 2 children and 1 lantern kept shielded to a slit. Eli kept his hand on his gun, and his eyes on the tree line, and his mind on the guide rope Lily had described and what it meant to go into floodwater in the dark. Lily stopped him with a tug on his coat sleeve when the lights of Hale's estate appeared through the trees. "The river door is to the left," she said. "Past the flat rock, there's a chain attached to the bank." "How deep is the water there normally?" "Past my waist," she said. Then she looked at the swollen, churning river and reconsidered. "More now." "Eli," Lucy said quietly beside him. He followed her gaze. A figure moving along the far end of the property, a guard making his round lantern swinging, working his way toward the river-facing side of the house. At his current pace, he'd be at the riverbank in 6 minutes. Maybe 7. "Wait here," Eli said. "Do not move. Do not make a sound." He moved along the bank low and fast, staying out of the guard's light, and he found the chain Lily had described, thick iron links bolted into a rock shelf at the waterline. Below the surface, barely visible as a dark shape, the outline of a door in the stone foundation. Just as she'd said. Just as she'd seen. The water was cold enough to stop his breath when it hit his legs. He went in anyway, hand on the chain, letting it pull him down along the foundation wall, and his boots found the submerged step ledge on the first try. And then his hands found the door latch, and it was not locked, because nobody locks a door that's supposed to be underwater and invisible. And the door swung inward against the current, and he went through it and came up inside. He'd expected darkness. He got a faint orange glow from somewhere further in a lantern or a lamp left burning probably for the guards who moved through here regularly. His eyes adjusted in seconds. Stairs going up to his left, rough stone water running down them in thin streams. And to his right below the stairs a corridor. He went back for the girls. Getting them through the flood entry was the hardest 30 seconds of the night. Lucy went under without a sound and came up shaking and silent. Lily went under and came up gasping, and Eli had his hand over her mouth before the sound could travel and held it there with his eyes locked on hers, saying without words, "I know. I know. Hold it." She held it. Inside, dripping, Lily oriented herself immediately. She turned right without hesitating and moved down the corridor with the quiet certainty of a child following a sound she'd memorized. Eli stayed right behind her. Lucy stayed right behind him. The corridor turned, then turned again. The faint smell of damp stone, and something else, lamp oil, and beneath it something more human and more desperate. Lily stopped in front of a heavy door with an iron bar across it. She pointed. Eli lifted the bar. It was heavier than it looked and scraped against the bracket as he pulled it free, and he held his breath at the sound. Nothing from outside. Nothing from the corridor behind them. He pushed the door open. The room was low-ceilinged and half-flooded water standing ankle-deep on the stone floor, rising as everything above ground pushed down. And in the far corner, chained at the wrist to an iron ring in the wall, was a woman. She was sitting up. She'd heard the door. Her head had come up and her eyes dark and exhausted, and still underneath all of it, sharp were on him, and she had her back to the wall and her free hand raised in the posture of someone who has decided that whatever comes through that door next, she is going to face it. Then Lily said, "Mama." And Claire Harper's entire face broke open. She didn't cry. She made a sound that wasn't crying something more foundational than crying something that comes from a place below, where words and tears live. And then she had both arms out as far as the chain would let her, which was not far enough. And both girls ran through ankle-deep water and crashed into her, and she pulled them against her chest with her free arm and held them with everything she had. Eli stood in the doorway and gave them 10 seconds. That was all he could spare. "Mrs. Harper," he said, keeping his voice low and level. "My name is Eli Cole. I need to get that chain off the wall, and I need us all moving in the next 3 minutes. Can you walk?" Claire pulled back from her daughters just enough to look at him. She assessed him the same way Lucy assessed strangers, fast, comprehensive, looking for the thing underneath the surface. Then she nodded. "The chain is bolted," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, but her mind was clearly all there. "The bolt is loose at the bottom. They didn't fix it when the wall started taking water damage. I've been working it for 2 weeks, but I haven't had the strength to finish." Eli crossed the room in 4 steps, went down on one knee in the standing water, and found the bolt by feel. She was right, it moved, just barely. He set both hands on it and put his full weight into a twisting pull, and the bolt groaned, and the stone around it cracked, and on the 3rd attempt, it came free from the wall entirely, and the chain dropped into the water. Claire stood up. She was taller than he'd expected. She was thin in the way people get thin when they haven't eaten properly in weeks. And she had bruising along her collarbone, visible above the collar of her ruined dress, and she stood up straight anyway, and she took one daughter's hand in each of hers, and she looked at Eli. "The tunnel entrance by the river," she said. "I know it's there. That's the way out." "Already found it," he said. "Let's move." They made it back to the corridor. They made it to the turn. They were 20 feet from the stairs when the lights in the building above came on all at once. Not lantern light, something brighter, like someone had opened every shutter and door on the floor above, and footsteps crossed the ceiling above them, heavy and deliberate, moving toward the basement stairs. Eli pulled everyone flat against the corridor wall. 3 sets of boots on the stairs. Coming down. He had his gun out. He looked at Claire over the girls' heads, and she looked back at him, and they were both doing the same math and arriving at the same answer. There was no other way out of this corridor except through those stairs, or back through the flood door. And the flood door was behind them, and time had just run out. The boots reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. A lantern swung around the corner, and behind the lantern, Victor Hale walked into the corridor and stopped when he saw them, and he didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't panic. He just looked at Eli with the steady, patient expression of a man who has been cornered before and found a way out every single time. "Well," Hale said, "I figured someone would come for her eventually." He tilted his head slightly. "I didn't figure it'd be a man I've never seen before." He was not what Eli had expected. He was medium height, well-dressed, even at this hour, the kind of man who looks like he runs something legitimate. His voice was reasonable, controlled, the voice of someone who has never needed to shout because things have always gone his way. "No badge," Hale said, studying Eli. "No official standing, just a drifter who found himself in somebody else's business." He almost smiled. "You understand that nobody in this county is going to take your word over mine. A man like you, a woman already known to be unstable." He glanced at Claire with something like polite regret. "Nobody's going to listen." "Then I suppose I don't need anybody to listen tonight." Eli said. I just need to get these 4 people out of your basement. Haley looked at the 2 men flanking him. Then he looked at Eli's gun. Then he looked at the rising water around everyone's feet, with the expression of a man recalculating. You're planning to go out through the river door, he said. That's right. In a flood. That's right. Hale studied him for another moment. You'll drown, he said. Not a threat, a prediction almost curious. All 4 of you. Maybe, Eli said. But we won't drown in your basement, which is what was going to happen to all 4 of us if we stayed. The water was at their ankles now, and rising, and somewhere above them something structural groaned under the weight of the flood, and Hale glanced up at the ceiling, with the first flicker of something other than control moving behind his eyes. That was when Eli saw Deputy Carroll. He was standing 1 step behind Hale's left shoulder, and he was looking at the 2 little girls, and his face was doing something that his orders clearly hadn't accounted for. He was looking at Lily and Lucy, the way a man looks at something he's done that he can't take back. Eli watched Carroll's hand, the hand that should have been going for his gun. It wasn't moving. Carroll, Hale said without looking at him. Take them. Carroll didn't move. Carroll. They're children, Victor, Carroll said. His voice came out unsteady, like something that had been held under pressure for too long. They're 4 years old. The corridor went dead silent, except for the water. Hale turned to look at his deputy with an expression that was more dangerous than anything he'd shown yet, precisely because it was still calm. I know how old they are, Hale said quietly. I put them in that sack, Carroll said. I put children in a sack and threw them in the river and He stopped. His jaw worked. I can't. You already did, Hale said. I can undo it, Carroll said, and he stepped sideways. Not forward. Sideways, putting himself between Hale and the family against the wall. The second man raised his gun. Eli moved first. Eli's shot took the second man's gun hand before the hammer fell, and the gun hit the water on the floor and sank, and the man grabbed his wrist and went down against the wall, and in the same half-second, Carroll moved not toward Eli, but toward Hale, stepping directly in front of him with both hands out. Stop, Carroll said. Victor, it's done. It's over. You need to stop. Haley looked at his deputy, the way a man looks at a tool that has broken at the worst possible moment. Not with rage, but with a cold, specific kind of contempt. You have no idea what you're throwing away, Hale said. No, Carroll said. I know exactly what I'm throwing away. His voice was shaking, but his body wasn't. I've known for 2 years what I'm throwing away every single morning I wake up and put that badge on. I just kept telling myself it wasn't my problem. He didn't take his eyes off Hale. Those children made it my problem. The water was at their shins. Above them, the groaning in the structure had become something more insistent, a deep, rhythmic creak that meant the flood pressure on the foundation walls was building toward something none of them wanted to be present for. Eli kept his gun up and looked at Claire. She was already moving both girls' hands in hers, pulling them toward the flood door at the corridor's end. She hadn't waited for permission, and she hadn't looked for reassurance, and he was beginning to understand that Claire Harper had been surviving on her own terms for a long time before this night. Go, he said. I'm right behind you. What about him? Claire said, meaning Hale without stopping moving. Carroll's got him. Carroll looked back at Eli with the expression of a man who has just signed something he can't unsign and is making peace with it in real time. Go, he said. Get them out. I'll hold here. You sure? Eli said. No, Carroll said. But I'm doing it anyway. Eli went. The flood door was the worst part. Claire went first with Lily, holding the girl against her chest and going under together. And Eli heard nothing for 4 seconds that felt considerably longer, and then heard splashing on the other side, and exhaled. Lucy went next alone. No hesitation, straight under and through, because Lucy had apparently decided that surviving was something she was going to be competent at, regardless of what it cost her. Eli went last, pulling the door shut behind him under the water, and the current hit him sideways coming through, and he lost the chain for one terrible moment before his hand found it again, and he drove up toward the surface. He came up gasping on the bankside. Claire was there already on solid ground, both girls pressed against her. The rain was still driving hard. The river churned 5 feet away. And Lucy was looking at Eli with that particular expression she wore when something had almost been a catastrophe, and she was processing the fact that it wasn't. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," Lucy said. Then after a beat, "That was very cold." "Yes, it was," he agreed, and despite everything, something close to a laugh moved through him before the urgency caught back up. He got them away from the water line, moving low along the bank toward the tree line, and that was when he heard the horses. Not one. 3, maybe 4 coming down the river road from the direction of town lanterns, swinging moving fast for the condition of the road. Eli put himself between the sound and Claire and the girls, and his hand went back to his gun, and for a long moment nobody breathed. Then one of the riders called out, "Cole!" "Eli!" "Cole, if you're out here, answer up." He knew that voice. "Briggs," he said, and said it louder. "Over here." Tom Briggs pulled his horse up 20 feet out and came off it before it had fully stopped covering the rest of the distance on foot, and behind him, 3 men in different clothing. Traveling coats, not local official cut, dismounted and spread out with the practiced efficiency of people who do this for a living. "You made it back," Eli said. "Didn't go," Briggs said. His face was doing something complicated, relief and urgency running against each other. "Sent the paper with a man I trust more than myself. Because 6 hours ago I got word that 3 federal marshals were already 4 hours out from this county." He stopped. "Someone else sent for them. 3 days ago." Eli stared at him. "Who?" Briggs jerked his head toward the estate building looming behind them. "Deputy Carroll," he said. "Apparently he wired Abilene before the storm. Said he had information regarding illegal detention and cargo trafficking under Victor Hale's operation, and he needed federal assistance before his nerve gave out entirely." Eli was quiet for a moment. "He didn't mention that," he said. "No," Briggs agreed. "Probably figured he hadn't earned the right to say it out loud yet." The lead marshal, a tall man named Garrett, who had the kind of permanently tired face that came from spending a career in places where the law was a suggestion rather than a fact, came forward and looked at Claire Harper and then at the 2 girls beside her, and then back at Claire. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "Are you injured?" "I'm alive," Claire said, "which is more than they planned." "Yes, ma'am. We're going to need a full statement." "You'll have one," Claire said. "But first, Victor Hale is in that building, and there's a deputy named Carroll in there with him who deserves different treatment than Hale when you go through that door." Garrett nodded once and looked at his men, and they moved. Eli watched them go and then looked back at Claire and the girls. Lily had both arms wrapped around her mother's waist, and her eyes closed, and she was just breathing, the deep, slow breathing of a child who has finally put a weight down. Lucy was standing slightly apart, watching the marshals approach the estate building with the focused attention of someone who wants to see this particular thing happen with their own eyes. "Carroll really sent that wire," Eli said to Briggs quieter. 3 days ago," Briggs said. "The man at the telegram office confirmed it when I went to send mine. Said it was the first message Carroll had ever sent that wasn't on Hale's orders, and he'd been waiting 5 years to receive one." Eli thought about Carroll standing in that corridor, putting himself between a powerful man and 4 people he owed nothing to except his conscience. A man who had made wrong choices for 2 years and finally made the right one when it mattered most. He didn't say any of that out loud. Some things don't need commentary. 15 minutes later, Victor Hale was brought out the front entrance of his own estate in handcuffs, and not the riverside where nobody would see, but the roadside facing the direction of town, where the sky was beginning to go gray at the edges with the first threat of morning. He walked with his head up and his face composed the way a man walks when he's deciding how the story of this gets told later. Except there wasn't going to be a later where he controlled the telling, and somewhere in the set of his jaw, he knew it. Deputy Carroll walked out behind him under his own power. Not in cuffs, and he stopped on the porch steps when he saw Claire Harper standing at the tree line. He stood there for a long moment with his hat in his hands, looking at a woman he had wronged in ways that didn't have simple remedies, and Claire looked back at him with an expression that held about 17 things at once, none of them simple. Carol said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. He just stood there and let her see him clearly, which was the first honest thing he'd done in a long time. Claire looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then she turned back to her daughters. That was all. Garrett posted men at every road exit from the estate and dispatched one rider back to town with documentation, and by the time sunrise was actually breaking, the storm opened, gray-pink light pushing through the cloud cover from the east. 3 more riders came in from the county road, not marshals. The county circuit judge, a man named Tanner, who had the look of someone who had been woken up abruptly and briefed even more abruptly, and 2 of his representatives, and they had the same paper in their possession that Tom Briggs had sent south the night before. Eli watched it all from the bank where he'd sat down in the wet grass because his legs had finally made the executive decision to stop performing. Lucy came and sat beside him without asking permission, which he was coming to recognize as simply how she operated. They watched a man who had owned most of a county get loaded onto a horse between 2 federal marshals, and they watched the town of Redwater Crossing begin to wake up and come to its front porches and its windows to see what all the commotion was. And they watched the faces of people who had looked the other way for years do the thing that faces do when the thing you were pretending wasn't there turns out to have been very real. It won't undo what happened, Lucy said. No, Eli agreed. It won't. But it stops what's next, she said. He looked at her. She was staring at Hale being led away, and her face was not triumphant. It was just tired and clear, and very much the face of a child who had lived through something she would carry in some form for the rest of her life. Yes, Eli said. It stops what's next. Mrs. Aldine arrived on foot 20 minutes after dawn, walking fast coat, buttoned crooked, and she went directly to Claire Harper, and held her by both arms, and looked at her. The way you look at someone you genuinely did not expect to see alive. And Claire held on to the older woman, and the 2 of them stood like that for a while, not saying anything, which is sometimes the most honest conversation available. When Mrs. Aldine finally stepped back, she looked at Eli across the yard and gave him a very small, very composed nod, which he understood to mean about 6 different things, all of them in the vicinity of gratitude. Marshal Garrett came back to Eli while the morning was still young and cold, and sat down on the bank nearby with his notebook open. I need your account, he said. Eli told it. All of it. The river, the sack, the cord on the girl's wrists. Carol at Mrs. Aldine's door, the guide rope under the floodwater, the chain in the wall, the corridor. Hale's face when he walked in and found them gone. He told it straight and factual, and didn't editorialize except once when he got to the part about Carol stepping sideways in the corridor. That man put himself between Hale's gun and those children, Eli said. I don't know what that's worth legally, but I know what it's worth. Garrett wrote it down without comment. The paper the Harper girl was carrying, Garrett said. You still have the original? Eli reached into his breast pocket and took it out, still damp but legible, and held it out. Garrett took it with both hands and opened it carefully and scanned it, and then looked up. These initials, Garrett said. 3rd column, you know whose they are? I have a guess, Eli said. But it's your job to confirm it, not mine. Garrett folded the paper back along its original creases. There are names in here that go above the county level, he said quietly, like a man thinking out loud more than speaking to Eli. Considerably above. I know, Eli said. This isn't just one corrupt businessman and one bought sheriff, Garrett said. I know, Eli said again. Garrett looked at the paper in his hand, then he put it in his inside coat pocket and buttoned it. Mrs. Harper is going to need protection, he said. She's going to need a lot of things, Eli said. But she's tougher than she looks and smarter than most people in that building gave her credit for, so I'd start with giving her back what's hers and letting her lead the way. Garrett studied him. You planning to stay in this county long? Eli looked at the sky, which was clearing from the east in long, pale strips. And he thought about Copper, still lame, still needing rest. And he thought about the road south he'd been planning to take. And he thought about two small girls sitting in wet grass watching justice get done with the focused attention of people who had earned the right to watch it. "I reckon a few more days," Eli said, "till things settle." Garrett nodded and stood. "I may need to reach you." "I'll be around," Eli said. He watched the marshal walk back toward the cluster of official activity around the estate. And then he felt a hand on his arm, small, deliberate, and looked down to find Lily standing beside him, still wrapped in the too big coat, looking up at him with an expression that was softer than anything he'd seen on her face since the river. "Thank you," she said, very small, very certain. Eli looked at her for a moment. He thought about telling her there was nothing to thank him for, that any decent man would have done the same, which was both true and irrelevant, because decent men had been walking past this situation for years and none of them had happened to be standing at the right pier in the right storm. Instead, he said, "Yes, ma'am." Lily nodded like that was the correct answer. Then she went back to her mother, and Claire gathered both girls in against her sides, and the three of them stood in the early morning light, looking at the river calmer. Now the flood peak passing the water beginning its slow retreat back to its own banks. And they looked like something that had been through a fire and come out the other side still standing. Eli stayed where he was and let them have it. Behind him, Redwater Crossing was waking up to a morning it had not prepared for, a morning where the name Victor Hale meant something different than it had at sundown, where a deputy with a guilty conscience had turned out to be the hinge. Everything swung on, where two children who were supposed to disappear into a river had instead turned a lantern on everything the town had agreed not to see. Tom Briggs came and stood beside Eli after a while, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "You think it'll hold?" Briggs said finally. "The charges, the trial." Eli thought about the paper now in Marshal Garrett's pocket. The names, the initials, the dates going back 3 years. "Yes," he said. "I think it'll hold." Briggs was quiet for another moment. "I haven't been sober at sunrise in 8 months," he said. "Didn't realize how different it looks." Eli looked at the sky. "Different," he agreed. "Or maybe just like it always looked, and you're just finally seeing it clear." Briggs didn't answer that. But he squared his shoulders and stood a little straighter, and he didn't look like a man who had lost everything anymore. He looked like a man who had just figured out there was still something worth keeping. The federal trial didn't begin until 6 weeks after the storm, but the unraveling started the morning after. It started with a woman named Rosa Medina, who worked the laundry at the hotel 3 streets from the river, and who had watched 2 men she recognized from Hale's docks escort a handcuffed woman through the back alley 18 months ago, and told herself it was none of her business, and had not slept clean since. She came to Marshal Garrett before noon on the first day, and sat in a hard chair in the requisitioned sheriff's office, and told him everything she'd seen, and when she finished, she looked at her hands and said, "I should have said something sooner." And Garrett told her that she was saying it now, and that now was what mattered, and Rosa Medina nodded and went home, and for the first time in 18 months, she slept without dreaming. Rosa was the first, she was not the last. By the end of that week, 11 people had come forward. By the end of the second week, 23. A former dock worker who had been threatened into silence. A school teacher who had seen financial records she wasn't supposed to see and been told to forget them. 2 men from the neighboring county who had lost brothers to Hale's river operation and been told by the local sheriff that their brothers had simply moved on. They came in 1s and 2s quietly to the office, where Marshal Garrett sat with his notebook and his permanently tired face, and each one of them sat down in that hard chair and said the same thing in different words I knew. "I was afraid. I should have spoken sooner." Garrett wrote it all down. Eli watched all of this from the periphery, which was where he was most comfortable. He'd fixed Copper's leg rest in time, and Mrs. Aldine's surprisingly extensive knowledge of animal injuries, and he'd been offered a room above the feed store by Tom Briggs, who had quietly become a different kind of man over the course of a single sleepless night, and seemed to be discovering that being that different kind of man suited him considerably better than the version he'd been living as. Briggs hadn't touched a bottle since the night they walked back through the rain together. He didn't make any announcements about it. He just stopped the way a man stops when he's finally found something worth being present for. Claire Harper was given temporary housing by the circuit court in a small property at the east end of town while the legal proceedings organized themselves, and she threw herself into the preparation with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting a very long time to finally say everything out loud in a room where it would be recorded and matter. She worked with Garrett's team every day, going through names and dates and cargo manifests with the kind of precise memory that came from having spent weeks in a stone room with nothing to do but organize her thoughts and keep them sharp against the possibility that she might someday need them. The girls were with her through all of it. Lily slept in her mother's bed every night and would for a long time yet. Lucy kept close, but watched the proceedings with those wide, serious eyes that seemed to be filing everything away for some future purpose. Only she understood. They were healing. Not in a clean, linear way. Lily still went, very still at loud noises, and Lucy still checked every room's exits the moment she entered it. But healing the way real things heal, unevenly and honestly, with good days and hard days, and the slow accumulation of moments that weren't frightening. Eli visited most afternoons. He told himself it was because Claire occasionally had questions about that first night that needed his account, and that was true as far as it went. But the fuller truth was something he didn't examine too closely, the way you don't examine a thing you're not ready to name yet. It was Mrs. Aldine who named it for him because Mrs. Aldine had apparently decided that the successful crisis gave her license to say whatever she wanted. "You had a daughter," she said one evening, without preamble, handing him a cup of coffee across her kitchen table. Eli looked at the cup. "What makes you say that? The way you look at those girls," she said, sitting down across from him with the directness of someone who has outlived the impulse toward tactful indirection. "Not like a man who's taken a responsibility, like a man who's remembering something." Eli held the cup in both hands and was quiet for a moment. "Her name was May," he said. "She was 6. Fever took her. Long time ago now. Mrs. Aldine didn't say she was sorry. She'd lived long enough to know that some griefs don't want sympathy, they just want to be acknowledged without being flinched at. So she just looked at him steadily and let the silence be what it was. "I've been moving since then," Eli said. "Not running, just moving. Easier to keep going than to find somewhere to stop." "And now," Mrs. Aldine said. Eli looked out the window at the street where Redwater Crossing was doing the slow, uncomfortable work of becoming a different version of itself. "Now I reckon Copper needs another week before that leg's road ready," he said. Mrs. Aldine looked at him with an expression that said she was perfectly aware that was not an answer to the question she'd asked, and that she was going to let him have it anyway. The trial opened on a Thursday in the county courthouse, which had been requisitioned by the federal circuit specifically because the local judicial infrastructure was itself under investigation. Judge Tanner presided. Garrett's team presented. And Carroll testified. He sat in the witness chair with his hat in his hands and his back straight, and he told the truth the way a man tells the truth when he knows it's the worst possible thing for himself, and does it anyway, without ornament, without excuse, without asking for anything in return. He laid out 2 years of corruption in specific dated, named detail. He described what moved on Hale's barges. He described where the money went. He described the night Claire Harper was taken, and what orders he received, and which ones he followed, and which ones he wished he hadn't. When he was done, the courtroom was very quiet. The prosecutor asked him one final question. "Deputy Carroll, you sent the wire to the federal marshal's office 3 days before the night of the flood. Why did you wait that long to act?" Carroll was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "Because I was a coward," he said. "And then I wasn't anymore. And I can't tell you exactly what changed except that one night I looked at what I was part of and I couldn't see a version of myself I wanted to be in it any longer." He paused. "That probably doesn't satisfy a courtroom, but it's the only true answer I've got." The prosecutor wrote something down and thanked him. Carroll stepped down from the stand and walked past the gallery without looking at anyone, and the doors closed behind him, and the trial moved on. Victor Hale was convicted on 14 counts. The verdict came back in under 2 hours, which is what happens when the evidence is what it was, and 23 witnesses have already told the same story from different angles. He was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, the same way he'd been led out of his own estate. Head-up face composed the last remaining performance of a man who had controlled everything for so long that he'd genuinely forgotten how to be something other than certain. Outside the courthouse, the town of Redwater Crossing stood in the street and watched, not cheering, not celebrating, just watching with the particular complicated expression of people confronting the distance between who they'd been and who they needed to become. Some of them had benefited from Hale's order. Some of them had simply looked away. Some of them had been too afraid to do anything else. All of them were standing in the same street now, in the same morning light, with the same evidence of what their silence had cost laid out in court documents for anyone to read. Rosa Medina was in the front of the crowd. She stood very straight, and she watched Hale pass, and she did not look away. That evening, Claire found Eli sitting on the steps of the temporary house, watching the light go off the river. She sat down beside him without asking, and they were quiet together for a while, which had become something they were able to do, the comfortable quiet of people who've been through enough together, that silence doesn't require management. "Garrett says the investigation goes up," she said. "Past Hale, past the county." "I know," Eli said. "There are people in territorial offices whose names are on that paper," she said. "It's going to take years." "Probably," he agreed. "But it started," Claire said. "Once it started, it doesn't stop. That's the thing about truth. It's not actually fragile. People think it is, but it's not. It just needs one crack in the wall." Eli looked at the river. The water was back to its normal level, running steady and ordinary in the early evening light. Nothing in it now but water and the reflection of the sky. Hard to believe it was the same river that had turned itself into something monstrous 3 weeks ago and swallowed a pier and a burlap sack and 2 small lives. "You're going to stay and see it through," he said. "Not a question." "Every day of it," Claire said. "Those people whose names are on the ledger, they're counting on this dying down, on people getting tired and moving on. I don't intend to get tired." "No," Eli said. "I don't reckon you do." She looked at him sidelong. "What about you?" Before he could answer, Lucy appeared in the doorway behind them. She had both shoes on for the first time since the night of the flood, which felt like a milestone worth noting. She looked at the two of them sitting on the steps and said with the frank assessment of a child who has decided something, "Eli Lilly wants to show you the river." Eli looked at Claire. Claire looked back at him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something much warmer than that. He stood up and followed Lucy around the side of the house to the bank. Lily was standing at the water's edge, not close enough to alarm anyone, just close enough to see it clearly. She'd been afraid of the river since the night they came out of it. He knew because Lucy had mentioned it the week before, matter of fact, the way Lucy mentioned most things, she won't go near the bank. She stands at the window and looks at it, but she won't go close. But she was close now. And she turned when she heard him coming, and she wasn't afraid. She looked not happy exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Resolved. "I wanted to see it when it wasn't angry," she said. "And," Eli said, coming to stand beside her. Lily looked at the water for a moment. "It's just a river," she said, with a kind of finality that sounded like the closing of a door that had been open too long. "It's just water." "Yes, ma'am," Eli said. "That's all it is." Lucy appeared on his other side, and the three of them stood there looking at the river in the evening quiet. And after a while, Lucy said without looking up, "Did the river try to take us away?" Eli looked at the water for a long moment. He thought about a flooded pier and a chain guide and a lantern swinging in the rain and 2 small voices where there should have been silence. He thought about May, who had been 6, and about the decade of moving that came after, and about what it meant to stop. "No, sweetheart," he said. "The river brought you to someone who would stop." Lucy absorbed that. She looked at the water with the careful, serious consideration she gave to everything. "Then I'm glad it was high that night," she said. Something in Eli's chest, which had been tightened around a particular grief for 10 years, shifted. Not broke, shifted the way a thing shifts when it's finally being put down properly, after being carried at the wrong angle for too long. He stayed for dinner that night. He stayed the night after that, and the night after that. And somewhere in those accumulating evenings, he stopped counting them as extensions of a temporary decision, and started understanding them as simply what his life was, now not arrived at by plan, but by the particular gravity of people who need each other in ways that don't require explaining. Tom Briggs hired on at the county stable and turned out to be better with horses than anyone had known, including himself. Mrs. Aldine was quietly consulted on 3 separate occasions by federal investigators, seeking background information on various individuals, and she provided it with the comprehensive precision of a woman who had spent 30 years watching a town and keeping everything she saw in very good order. Deputy Carroll was convicted of 4 counts of conspiracy, reduced from 12 on the strength of his testimony. He served 2 years. When he came out, he did not return to Redwater Crossing. He moved north to a smaller town and took work as a carpenter, and if he thought about the corridor and the chain and the 2 children in the floodwater, he kept those thoughts to himself. What he had done in that corridor was not enough to erase what came before it. But it was real, and it was his. And it was more than nothing. The investigation climbed as Claire had said it would, slowly with reversals and delays, and the particular grinding resistance of powerful men who have built their power on the assumption that nobody will look too hard. But it climbed. 3 territorial officials resigned. 2 were indicted. The Federal Circuit Court appointed a special examiner for the entire River Corridor County. And the cargo barges that had moved through Redwater Crossing under Hale's name were impounded, and the records found in their holds confirmed every name on Claire Harper's paper and added 40 more besides. The story traveled. Newspapers in Abilene, and then in Dallas, and then further east, picked it up: the woman who survived the evidence hidden on her daughters, the storm that cracked everything open. It was the kind of story that people needed to hear, not because it was exceptional, but because it proved something they wanted to believe: that one person keeping a record, refusing to be silent, hiding the truth in the most vulnerable and irreplaceable place available, the hands of her children, could be enough. That it wasn't always enough. But that sometimes it was. Claire read every article with precise, critical attention. She corrected the errors that needed correcting and let the rest stand. When a journalist from Dallas arrived in Redwater Crossing and asked to interview her, she sat down with him for 2 hours and told the story without embellishment and without omission. And when he asked how she had survived 6 weeks of captivity without losing her mind, she said, "I had 2 reasons, and they were 4 years old, and I intended to get back to them." The journalist wrote it exactly as she said it. It ran on the front page. Lily read it to Lucy that night, sitting at the kitchen table, working through each word with the careful concentration of a child who has recently decided that reading is a thing she intends to be very good at, because knowledge is the kind of thing that cannot be taken from you in a sack and thrown in a river. She finished the article and looked up at her mother. "You didn't say anything about Eli," she said. "He asked me not to," Claire said. Lily considered this with a small frown. Why? Eli, who was sitting at the other end of the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, looked up. "Because that story's yours," he said. "Not mine. I just happened to be at the right pier." Lily looked at him for a long, thoughtful moment with those eyes that had been through too much and come out the other side still steady. "You stayed, though," she said. "Yes," he said. "I stayed." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back to the newspaper. Lucy folded her hands on the table and looked at Eli with the expression she wore when she had already reached a conclusion and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The river ran on outside, ordinary and clean in the morning light, carrying nothing in it now but the seasons turning and the long, slow fact of water finding its way home. And in a small house in Redwater Crossing, at a table with coffee going cold, and a newspaper being read aloud in a child's careful voice, something that had been broken for a very long time was quietly, stubbornly putting itself back together, not into its original shape, because that shape was gone, but into something new and solid and built to last. Some things the river takes. Some things it carries to exactly where they belong. And the difference between the two has everything to do with who happens to be standing on the bank when the water runs high and whether they have the courage to reach in.